Sen Gupta. I'm delighted to have Rahul Sen with me, joining all the way from Auckland. Rahul is an expert on Indo-Pacific trade, should I say, but especially on India-New Zealand trade. And he really is here to talk to me about what India hopes to achieve in its ties with New Zealand. More importantly, what does New Zealand hope to achieve with its trade ties with India? But the bigger picture is, for these ties to bloom, what kind of ecosystem must be built between these two countries to achieve the kind of growth and economic momentum that perhaps both countries deserve and both countries certainly seek. Rahul, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Andol. Good to be here.
I want to begin by asking you, this conversation got triggered by something you wrote, on LinkedIn about how
Uh-huh.
New Zealand wants deeper and more engaging trade ties with India, but an ecosystem is needed to really trigger that boost.
Yes.
Talk me through your
Yeah.
argument.
Well, first of all, India, if we look at the current radar of New Zealand trading partners, has actually fallen below the ranking compared to pre-COVID, which is actually, if you go back into the history of India, New Zealand, in terms of building its ties, I think the last big prime ministerial delegation that visited India was that of John Key when he was New Zealand's prime minister. And that was way back in 2011. And there were hopes actually of achieving a bilateral free trade agreement, and sort of negotiations started on that basis. But then, of course, one of the key things so far as the New Zealand economy is concerned, and you would be definitely aware, is that its primary exports is dairy products, and that's where, of course, India has very strong hold globally. And clearly, because of that, the negotiations didn't quite progress in terms of tariff negotiations as New Zealand was hoping to. And I also think, as you mentioned about the ecosystem, I think it's very important to also look at how Australia built up its ties with India. And New Zealand actually, very surprisingly, didn't actually note that at all. In fact, I would say that it's just post-COVID, with this India-Australia Act being signed, they have suddenly woken up to this reality that they need to revisit and look at improving this economic ties with India. But as I was mentioning to you back in 2011, that was not the case. So New Zealand was actually hoping to get those tariff concessions and get on a bilateral free trade agreement. And to give you a little bit of a perspective here, if you look at New Zealand's trade, most of its top trading partners are with the ones that it has, free trade agreements. European Union and UK, of course, are the recent ones with which it has signed a free trade agreement. US is probably one of the exceptional ones on that list, but otherwise, most of the other countries, it already has a free trade agreement. And the way, at least I have seen in my interactions with the Business Council and with the businesses and the industry here, is, they really like to have these free trade agreements as part of that ecosystem to, build up the economic and trade ties. And they haven't probably recognized that, at least in the Indian context, and that's the way I look at it very clearly, what works more is not a free trade agreement where you are just talking about tariff concessions. What works more is in the area of negotiations on services and investment, particularly a movement of professionals, which is where India's strengths are. And the negotiations didn't actually proceed on that direction so far as the bilateral talks were concerned, which was, during that pre-COVID period. And thereafter, of course, a new government took over, and because of, some issues related to immigration sensitivities here, there were rules changed with respect to, international students coming in and stuff like that. So that affected New Zealand's trade with India quite significantly, because the big chunk of New Zealand exports to India is actually travel services, and a lot of that is education-related travel. So obviously, during COVID, as you may be aware, India was sort of declared as a high-risk country at some point of time by the New Zealand government. The borders were kept, I think, shut for a little bit longer period than other countries. And all this was sort of course, noted with some concern from, the Indian policymakers. And therefore, when the External Affairs Minister visited us last year, he really very clearly expressed those concerns that, probably, the issue could have been handled with a little bit more sensitivity. But again, going back from the economic perspective, what was really made clear is that there would not be a possibility of having a free trade agreement with India, at least before thinking about any kind of a mobility partnership. So again, there comes back my point that, from India's point of view, and this is what we have seen with Australia-India ECTA as well, right? That you've had some tariff concessions from Australia, but then at the same time, of course, Australia has changed its rules and regulations related to international students. Mutual recognition of qualifications are the ones that is being discussed right now. We are moving into a comprehensive economic partnership. And I think that's what, triggered my article at that point of time, because I really believe that what New Zealand now needs to look at, if it is very serious about creating that ecosystem, is to think about building a long-term economic partnership with India, where it can also help in the development of India, particularly in agri-tech and agriculture sectors, where New Zealand has a strong comparative advantage.
So take us through. This is a very interesting argument. Take us through what consists of making this ecosystem. How does one build this ecosystem? What are the measures to take? You just mentioned agri-tech as one of the areas where there could be sustained efforts. What are the others? Mobility is one more. But talk us through a little bit about, we now increasingly hear of the Indian communities, importance in Australia. Talk us through a little bit about the Indian community in New Zealand and what kind of importance does it have? Could that importance be growing? Take us through how this ecosystem that you talk about, how will it be developed? How will this long-term partnership actually on sheer brass tacks, so to speak, point by point, according to you, can be developed?
Well, of course, I think in terms of the ecosystem, the first one that we have here is the business links, and that's already thriving. We have the India-New Zealand Business Council, which is a very active body, and throughout their annual summits and throughout their events, they are always trying to push, the thinking of industry and also for policymakers to look more closely at India. So that's one part of the ecosystem which is very nicely working. And then we have the growing Indian diaspora, as you mentioned. And it was very interesting to note, I think it was a report which was prepared by the Waitakere Indian Association, which is one of the Indian associations here. And they looked at the economic contribution, actually, of the Indian diaspora here, people of ethnic Indian origin. And it appeared to be that they were contributing about $10 billion GDP annually to New Zealand, 5% of the population. So it's not huge, but it's sizable. It's growing. The presence is there in political circles. We have ethnic Indian representation across major political parties in New Zealand. So the voices are being heard. In fact, very recently, National Party, which is currently in opposition, even went to the extent to say that they see a free trade agreement as a strategic priority if they are re-elected. So I think that there is an ecosystem, but what I think is sort of missing is the thought that, India would be a very important partner to have as part of an economic risk diversification. Because for New Zealand, almost a third of its trade is with China. And that's the biggest trading partner. And clearly, during COVID, with supply chain disruptions, it has come to the fore for many New Zealand businesses that relying very exclusively on one trading partner can create future supply chain risks as well. Because obviously, this was not a pandemic. You could always have more serious health-related crisis in the near future. And I think that's where New Zealand needs to think long-term. And what I have noticed is the the policymakers' approach here have been a lot more short term. They're not looking at the benefits of having that partnership around, mobility or around, skill transfer, or even around education collaboration. I mean, there are, memorandum of understanding which has been signed by some New Zealand universities in some areas, like IIT Delhi, for example, has a New Zealand center now. Also, there has been a memorandum of understanding signed with our university, AUT, with IIT Madras. So there are few examples of that emerging, but certainly the push which should be there basically from the government to government level to take the relationship to the next level. That is obviously not there, and that is probably not there because I would say to some extent that I think from the Indian perspective, they are probably not seeing that that there is a very clear strategy from New Zealand policymakers that this is where we want to achieve our relationship with India in the next couple of decades, like Australia had, for example. They had a very clear-cut 2035 India economic strategy. There is no such document which actually exists at the moment from the New Zealand government perspective in terms of where it sees that relationship with India. So I think that is, so in terms of building up that ecosystem, building mutual trust, having high-level visits much more frequently. So as our, Honorable High Commissioner mentioned at trade symposium, which we had at the High Commission a couple of days back, she said, the ties have to move beyond cricket and curry. So in New Zealand, the ties are very much around that cricket and curry kind of thing,
I have
So
two questions.
they need to think beyond that. Yeah.
I have two questions. Number one, do
Sure.
you believe, Rahul, that considering most of India, New Zealand's trade is now with China, do you believe personally that boosting trade with India should be a strategic priority for New Zealand?
Yes, I think it should be a strategic priority, and this is really the time for them to rethink because they are obviously with the India-Australia EFTA in force, and of course developing into a comprehensive economic cooperation. There is already, I think, evidence of trade diversion, and that will come up in a lot more bigger way as some trade is diverted, from New Zealand in favor of Australia. That is bound to happen. And one of the things that is also important for New Zealand to understand is the big chunk of New Zealand-China trade is mainly manufacturing. Now, where it can actually gain from India is through partnership in the services sector. So, and in that sense, therefore, the FTA approach, as I was saying, is probably not going to work if, the New Zealand policymakers think that first we should get access to, some dairy products and some of our agri products, and then we can think on, whether we can have mutual recognition of qualifications for Indian professionals in New Zealand. I don't think that approach is going to work. And this has been pointed out actually by a lot of New Zealand analysts who have been traveling to India and have been closely observing India, that the approach to developing that close economic and strategic ties with India will have to start very differently than they have worked with other free trade agreement partners. It doesn't start with, just tariff concession. It has to start with building up that trust. And one of the key elements that is actually missing, since you mentioned about the ecosystem, and that definitely is a big hindrance, is that even with, so much of our Indian diaspora presence here, we still don't have a direct flight connection. There is no direct connection from New Zealand to India. And this has been advocated for a long, long time, both by the Indian diaspora as also by the Indian New Zealand Business Council. But somehow, because of whatever reasons, that has not, really come to fruition. And I see this as a big hindrance because, if you want to travel to India, from here right now, you have to look at least 8 to 10 hours transit, and especially given COVID and whatnot that has happened in the last couple of years. The last thing people want is to keep transiting at the airport for 8 to 10, 12 hours, and definitely that's a big hindrance, especially when we talk about business ties. So, and of course, it increases the transport costs as well. So I think at the very least, if New Zealand is very serious about taking the relationship with India to the next level and looking at India as a partner over the next decade, just as Australia has, it will have to very seriously think about having that air services agreement with a direct air connectivity as a priority. That has to has to come, because without that, a free trade agreement will really not be of much use in that sense. Yeah.
About the Indian community there, when you mentioned curry and cricket, I'm
Hmm.
reminded that even a few years ago, maybe a decade ago, or even 5, 7 years ago, the same used to be said about India and Australia, that three things hold India and Australia together: curry,
Yeah.
cricket, and the Commonwealth.
Yeah.
And look how far we have come from there. Look how
Yeah.
far the India
Yes.
Australia relationship has come from there. You would
Yeah.
scarcely find, an Indian or an Australian politician or anybody else defining the relationship in terms of Commonwealth curry and
Yeah.
cricket anymore.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
reminded of the Australian, politician who mentioned in 2008 that from Chennai to Perth was closer
Hmm.
than many other parts of the world to Australia.
Hmm.
A straight line from Chennai to Perth is actually not that far away. And
Hmm.
when you're talking about direct plane connectivity between New Zealand and England, New Zealand and India, I'm reminded of that, and the how things can change overnight. Tell us a little bit about the diasporic influence and whether what's happening there, and whether that can push some of the ideas that you are talking about.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, the diaspora is very sizable and growing,
How
and
big is
we
it?
have I mean, it's I think about 150,000 right now, if I'm not
Yeah.
wrong. So about 5%, roughly about 5% of the population. And of course, here in New Zealand, we also have ethnic Indians from Fiji who also are, sometimes identify themselves as Indians as well. So, the data in that sense could be, bit fuzzy around there, but said and done, I think that particular report, and it was shared with the ministries. I remember there was an event around that, and it was I think the acknowledgement was very much there that the Indian diaspora is very very strongly contributing to the New Zealand economy. In fact, a lot of the international students were at the backbone during New Zealand's COVID crisis, where a lot of them actually took up some of those part-time jobs, which was basically the essential, sort of services which were on when most of the borders were closed and things like that. So I think there is very clear recognition so far as the New Zealand policymakers are concerned that Indian diaspora is very hardworking, very strongly contributing to the development of New Zealand. Uh, I mean, personally, if you ask me, and I think you alluded to that question as well, that given that New Zealand's current trading relationship is so heavily dependent on one trading partner, whether it is going to look at economic diversification in the same Australia has done. And I think one of the key hindrances, in my perspective, just might be that because New Zealand is in a much smaller open economy, and therefore probably not in terms of bargaining power. If you think about it, is compared to Australia-China relationship, if you think about it, it's obviously not at that particular level. And that might be one of the reasons why New Zealand policymakers might want to see themselves as being going away from that relationship that they have had with their large trading partners. So I think they have to balance it and play it in a nuanced way. and maybe that is the reason why we do not see a very sudden shift. But as we have discussed, I think the momentum is very much there. We have good Indian ethnic representation across the political spectrum. And coming New Zealand elections, I'm sure, New Zealanders of Indian ethnicity will have a big say in terms of the outcome of this election. So I think sooner or later, I mean, right now, the diaspora, as I said, is about 5% of the population. That is going to grow. And as that grows, I would definitely see that ultimately the policymakers might be a little bit more, if I would suppose to think that, they have to very seriously consider this relationship of building the long-term partnership. I think thinking is already there among some policymakers. I can see that thinking changing. They do view a lot of economic developments happening in India with very, very positively. But unfortunately, I think there is a section here in the community which also is skepticist of the style of the Indian Prime Minister. I was interviewed on TVNZ, and I was straight away asked the question that whether his authoritarian style would affect the relationship. And my straight away response was that, look, he's a very decisive politician, and that's what you want. If you want to get things done in a developing country, that's the style of leadership you want. So, so I think, those perceptions, those divided perceptions exist here as well, that unfortunately in some sections of the society, still exists. I guess in Australia also, we did see, some of those sentiments, when Prime Minister Modi was there. But I think overall, there is a very strong push from the Indian New Zealand Business Council. They have done a very comprehensive report recently. In fact, I'll be happy to share that report with you, in which they have actually quite clearly identified not just the sectors, but also in terms of, how this relationship really needs to go to the next level. It's kind of ready to go, but it's just that the momentum has to be built up. And I very recently, in fact, wrote an article also, and I have argued that the focus, maybe, New Zealand should not even use the term free trade agreement. It should now just say we want a comprehensive economic partnership. That's the kind of relationship we want to look at.
Say that again, please. I didn't quite catch. What did you say? New Zealand should now aim at what?
Yeah, sorry.
You said New Zealand should now aim at what?
A comprehensive economic partnership,
yes.
Moving beyond just a free trade agreement. So I think that is the approach that Australia has worked with Australia, and that is the approach that will work with New Zealand as well. So it is going to be a bit difficult, I think, from the New Zealand negotiators' perspective, because as I mentioned to you, all the past free trade agreements really have been mainly focused around tariff concessions, given New Zealand's comparative advantage in agricultural products. New Zealand-China free trade agreement, interestingly, first was almost entirely on manufacturing goods and tariff concessions, and then services and investment costs have come up as part of the revised FTA. But for India, they have to realize it will have to work the opposite. They have to start with services and investment to get anywhere to that comprehensive economic partnership. And as I had also mentioned in that interview with TVNZ here, when they were worried about dairy not getting access. So again, the point is that there are opportunities for investments for New Zealand agribusiness in technology, which can help improve their dairy yield for India. And similarly for a lot of fruits, like in horticulture, New Zealand horticulture is already in Himachal Pradesh. They have helped improve the productivity of apples from there. So those are simple examples where investments and partnerships will increase the trust, and I think that would be a good foundation to this long-term partnership. Like, to give you numbers, New Zealand's, I think, investment in India is barely 0.01%. So that shows that it really needs to move up the radar in terms of building up that relationship through investment. So it's not just about trade. It's not just about exports and imports. It's also about investments. It's also about people-to-people connections. So that's where we would want the relationship to go.
All right. Rahul, that's been fascinating talking to you. I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you for your time. I'm sure we'll have more conversations in the future as this relationship progresses. And thanks very much for all the explanation that you gave us. It really seems like the India-New Zealand relationship is a sort of hidden gem which should now be, in a sense, discovered, in the diplomacy of the two countries so that both countries can profit. Rahul Sen, thanks very much.
I think the time has come. Yeah, I think the time has really come. So we have to take this to the next level. So thank you very much. And loved talking to you as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.